Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's seminar from PermafrostNet. Allow me to introduce today's speaker. Danielle Chiasson is a master's student at the Permafrost Research Laboratory at Université Laval under the supervision of Pascal Roy-Lévy and Najat Biri. Danielle brings a paleoecological approach to her permafrost geomorphology lab to better understand thermokarst lake basins after drainage. Take it away, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. And yes, hi, bonjour, Gwinsi, everyone. I'm excited to present my results, my project to you all today, where we will be visiting Old Crow Flats in the Vuntut-Quechin traditional territory to explore the post-drainage evolution of vegetation succession and basin morphology of Wolverine Lake, which is a large lake that drained prior to anthropogenic climate warming. So yes, let's take a trip to Old Crow Flats, or Vantat in Quechin, meaning land of many lakes. Old Crow Flats is located in an interior basin of northern Yukon. It's a large permafrost lowland about the size of Prince Edward Island, and it has a very interesting developmental history, especially when it comes to paleoecology. This area was part of Beringia and remained unglaciated during the last glacial maximum. Glacial advances flooded the area and created a large glacial lake that eventually drained around 15,000 years ago. And here you can kind of see the footprint of what Glacial Lake Old Crow used to be. Since drainage, the area has become a dynamic thermokarst landscape with continuous ice-rich permafrost, a thick peat cover, and thousands of lakes and wetlands at the forest-tundra transition. In 2019, the Vuntut-Quechin First Nation declared a climate change state of emergency due to rapid environmental change in their traditional territory, which threatens their safety and cultural survival. So my goal as a paleoecologist is to help better understand the current environmental change, specifically in drain lake basins, by investigating what happened in the past. Old Crow Flats may be the land of many lakes, but it's also the land of many drain lake basins. These basins can range from decades to thousands of years old and have different morphologies and vegetation depending on their age. In terms of morphology, young basins have raised margins and depressed centers with remnant ponds, whereas old basins are the opposite, with depressed margins and raised centers. Although post-drainage conditions have been well documented in modern basins, little is actually known about the transition from young to old basins. Luckily, drain basins and their thick peat covers are excellent paleoarchives. And what about differences in vegetation? So early vegetation succession following drainage has been described by Trevor Lance, where the rapid development and mortality of tall willow thickets is commonly found within the margin of young basins and represents an intermediate stage of succession. The rapid shrubification of younger basins can also have negative effects on permafrost recovery. The vegetation in older basins is either dominated by dwarf shrubs, tussock tundra, or mosses. So another question I have with this project is, did tall willow thickets also exist in the margins of older basins, or are they a product of climate warming? To answer these questions, we turn to Wolverine Lake. And why Wolverine Lake? That's because it's a large lake that we know drained catastrophically prior to anthropogenic climate warming, and previous work on its basin morphology has been done by Pascal. We can also compare it to Nitro Lake, which is a similarly shaped lake nearby that drained catastrophically in the last 50 years. So this makes Wolverine Lake and its drainage basin outlined here a good candidate for paleoreconstruction. Okay, so in order to reconstruct vegetation succession of the basin, we collected peat samples from two sites, one from the wet depressed margin and one from the dry elevated center. And hopefully in this satellite imagery, you can see the frozen lake, the ice still in here, but you can see that the margin here is much more wet compared to the center I then conducted loss on ignition and macrofossil analyses at 1 centimeter intervals to determine organic matter content, the peat composition, as well as identify remnant plant material like seeds and leaves, most of the time down to the species level. And doing this can help us link indicator species to specific environments. I then sent plant material for radiocarbon dating to determine time since drainage from the basal peat, as well as the timing of major vegetation changes within the peat samples. The radiocarbon dates were also used to create age depth models that provide rates of vertical peat accumulation, as well as interpolated dates for each depth of the sample. So what kind of results would this produce? First, we're going to take a look at a few soil and peat profile characteristics. So here at the margin, we've got stratigraphy, organic matter content, vertical accumulation rate, and matrix composition from plant material in the monolith and core sample that I got from the margin. And I know this is a lot of stuff to look at here, but let me just point out a few key things. So you can see in the stratigraphy at the base here, it's very decomposed organic mineral material, but there's a band of sandy material here, which was most likely deposited during a major drainage event. Another thing is to point out the mineral organic transition. So in a drained lake basin, when you get your peat profile, you can usually see a stark difference change where the peat ends and where the mineral lake sediment starts. However, in this sample, it was more difficult to determine, to visually see it in the field and in the lab. So where I thought, it was at the base here at 70 centimeters. But then upon loss on ignition, you can see that organic matter content actually increases to over 30%, which is now considered organic, and above 35 towards 50% is considered peat. So that mineral organic transition is actually at 47 centimeter depth here. We can see also that the accumulation rate fluctuates along with major changes in vegetation composition. And then in terms of the matrix composition, I'll just note that here we've got a large influx of brown mosses, and we'll return to that later in the interpretation of the macrofossils. At the center, things are a little more simple. Here was an example that in the field, when we dug out the peat monolith, that the mineral sediment was right at the base. So that mineral organic transition is right at the bottom here. It coincides with organic matter content. But I was a little scared that I was missing something below that, since there were still a lot of plants and plant remnants and macrofossils below the mineral organic transition at the margin. So I did a few analyses below in the core we collected after the monolith, and it was purely silty glacial lacustrine material with low organic matter content, and there was absolutely no plant material or macrofossils below that depth. And then I guess another thing to point out here is that bryophytes really dominate the peat composition towards the top at the center here. Here we're looking at some more paleogenetic macrofossil stuff. So here's an example of a macrofossil diagram. Of all the species I was able to identify from a margin sample. And with this information, you can identify macrofossil zones here at the side that represent major changes in vegetation composition. So I've got my main zones divided by the solid red line, and then subzones divided by the dotted red line. So zone 1 is the pre-drainage marsh environment that's really dominated by aquatic species. And there's two subzones here. That 1A really kind of represents the marsh environment. And then 1B, we could see that along with that band of sandy material, we have kind of most species disappear, except for a few aquatic species that are probably remnants in the pools during this time. So this was a time of disturbance and probably the beginning of the large drainage event. Zone 2 represents a post-drainage environment characterized by peat-forming fen communities. So it's dominated by graminoids, shrubs, and bryophytes that reflect changes in topography and hydrology. 2A is a mud, like the post-drainage mud flat. And the only species present here is Carex aquatilis, which is a dominant species, pioneer species in drained basins. 2B, we've got a more diverse environment collection of species here, most likely representing a wet sedge meadow. And then 2C is what is interesting with the influx of this, coincides with the influx of brown mosses, most likely representing a moderate rich fen. And then macrofossil zone 3 is a post-drainage environment characterized by an increase in sphagnum mosses and a mixture of bog and fen species. In terms of the center, we've got 4 zones. I've put zone 1 here to show that although at the margin we had marsh environment, here at the center we absolutely have no macrofossil remains. And so this was an open water part of the lake. Zone 2, we've got our fen environment, our wet sedge meadow dominated by hydrophilic sedges. Zone 3 is our wet sphagnum bog with the establishment of some black spruce and some other shrubs. And then zone 4 is a zone we didn't have in the margin that represents a tussock tundra stage with tussock forming sedges, and it's dominated by ericaceous shrubs. So on the following slides, I'll further describe these main 4 macrofossil zones, along with a conceptual model of post-drainage evolution, so we can better visualize it. Okay, so prior to drainage, Wolverine Lake was a 290 square kilometer thermokarst lake undergoing active lake expansion. The first zone in my macrofossil record reveals that the margin was characterized by an early successional shallow lakeshore marsh that lasted for around 2,000 years. This community contained emergent marsh vegetation, as well as terrestrial species that were most likely from the eroding shoreline. The center was still open water with no macrofossil evidence below the mineral organic transition. And here I've got a little diagram of what it would have looked like. Just to point out here, the morphology of the basin is we've got kind of that thin layer of coarser material, which would have been deposited in the lake due to erosional processes and wave action that would take the coarser material from the shoreline and redistribute it throughout the lake basin. And then on top of that would be a deposit of the finer deep water deposits that take longer to settle. And so there's more of that accumulates towards the center of the lake basin. So we'll see how that evolves. Okay, so the lake drains catastrophically from the southeast corner here around 730 years before present. Similar basal peat dates from the margin and the center suggest that the lake drained from at least that end of the basin, which is over here, at the same time. So the drainage can be attributed to a large singular catastrophic drainage event, most likely caused by lateral bank erosion and shoreline breaching with a smaller lake next to it. It's difficult to see in this image, but a little lake here. That drainage event really cut through and created a large drainage channel, which is now like a river that connects down to other river networks in Old Crow Flats. So the resulting drainage basin is 5.9 square kilometers at the southern tip of Wolverine Lake. And this partial drainage may reflect differences in lake bathymetry prior to drainage. In terms of permafrost, so once the lake drains, permafrost aggradation is expected to begin in the exposed lake sediment, the first winter following drainage. Okay, so the second zone in my macrofossil record reveals that following drainage, the margin evolved from a marsh to a mid-successional fen, with transitions, like I mentioned previously, from a mudflat to a wet sedge meadow and then a moderate rich fen. Whereas the center evolved from open water to a wet sedge meadow, skipping that early successional marsh stage. The community persisted for 300 to 400 years and contained fen species dominated by hydrophilic sedges, the most abundant and dominant being Carex aquistilis. The rate of peat accumulation is high during this time, especially in the margin, and small peat mounds and ridges begin to form, creating microtopography where drier species of dwarf shrubs and even black spruce can establish. During this post-drainage time frame, as observed in modern basins, we'd expect to see the rapid development of willows. But I found little evidence, actually hardly no macrofossil evidence of willow species in the macrofossil record of the margin or the center of this basin. In terms of morphology, the basin floor is becoming flatter. There's more segregated ice forming in the fine-grained sediment at the center. Ice wedge polygonal networks are beginning to develop. And after 300 years, according to the Stefan solution, we would expect permafrost to reach depth of 25 meters. The third zone in my macrofossil record reveals an evolution from a mid-successional fen to a mid-successional bog in both the margin and the center. What's interesting, though, is that 300 years post-drainage, the transition to bog vegetation at the center coincides with that influx of brown mosses that we saw in the margin, which could suggest that enough ice segregation and ground surface heaving at the center has caused a change in basin topography and hydrology, where surface runoff is now directed towards the margin, maintaining its wetness and probably contributing to that zone becoming a moderate rich fen. The bog vegetation in the center is dominated by sphagnum mosses with some black spruce, ericaceous shrubs and sedges, whereas the vegetation in the margin is more diverse with a mixture of fen and bog species like hydrophilic sedges, dwarf shrubs, sphagnum mosses, and this reflects microtopography in the form of elevated peat ridges and wet depressions that form a patterned wetland or a string bog, which is a really interesting, cool wetland type that is nice to visually look at pictures and easy to see when you're flying over the basin in a helicopter and looking at satellite imagery. So ground heaving at the center continues and it's now causing surface uplift and the margin is now wetter. We can see here that ice wedge polygons continue to develop. Low center polygons are mostly found in the margin, whereas high centered polygons are in the center. And after 500 years, permafrost would reach a depth of 33 meters. My final macrofossil zone represents what is observed today at the margin in the center of the basin. So as surface uplift continues at the center, the sphagnum bog vegetation evolves to a drier tussock tundra, which is a late successional stage. This stage is reached within 600 years post-drainage, which I believe to be an accelerated rate due to the ongoing surface uplift. And for a bit of perspective, Lynn Ovenden did a paleo reconstruction of polygonal peatland in Old Crow Flats. So not directly in a drain lake basin, but all of Old Crow Flats is one big drain lake basin. And in that context, it took a couple thousand years for the succession to reach the late successional stage of the tussock tundra. So much longer than here in this drain basin. The margin, it remains a wet bog, or more specifically a string bog. Some people also call it a patterned fen. The main takeaways from the project: firstly, the absence of tall willows in my macrofossil record suggests that the rapid willow development seen in young basins today may be a contemporary phenomena and the product of climate warming. Secondly, the topographical transition from young to old basins, where the center is more elevated, begins 300 years post-drainage. And thirdly, the center reaches a late successional tussock tundra stage within 600 years post-drainage, which, as I explained, I believe to be pretty quick, most likely accelerated by that heave at the center of the basin. And so I hope I was able to properly show you guys or demonstrate that paleoecology in combination with geomorphology can be a powerful tool to better understand how these systems have evolved over time. So yes, thank you, merci Cho, everyone, for listening up, and yeah, I'm ready to answer any questions, comments you have.
I have a quick first question. What would be some next steps for this kind of work?
Ooh, well, I'm a master's student, it's a master's project, and so at the beginning of the project, I had much bigger plans and ideas, stuff to look at. So actually, I'd collected some really good samples from that small lake basin located next to this one that drained at the same, well, might have drained before, but was cut through by that drainage channel. So I did want to compare those two basins. And yeah, I'm working with Pascal and our team at the lab here to send more samples from drained basins in Old Crow Flats to get like times and dates of radiocarbon dates to get different drainage ages, basin ages. So that's kind of a big thing too. There's tons of basins at different developmental stages in Old Crow Flats. So it'd be nice to get more information there and to compare that. But yeah, I would have loved to continue the macrofossil analysis and look at the other old basins to also see if that willow development is recorded in the present in the macrofossil record of older basins, because I was pretty surprised to not find any willow macrofossils at my sites.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Igor, you have a question.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for a very interesting talk and very educational. My question is regarding the frost susceptibility of the drained lakes. So what the factor that can trigger the migration, the moisture to the center of the lake and to create the frost heave or injection of the moisture and create the ice core? Is it existence of fine grained materials for the traveling the water in the films, or other factors can create a scenario when we have a frost heave or pingo or whatever in the drained lake?
So Pascal has published an article with her model of basin morphology in Old Crow Flats, and what's interesting and different about the post-drainage evolution in Old Crow Flats, which is different than, like, say, in Alaska, where other research has been done, is that I think that in her paper, she does explain that it really has to do with the fine grain sediment, and that in Old Crow Flats, there's a lack of like littoral terraces along the margins of the lakes. So if I understand the question properly, I think that the fact that there's a larger accumulation of that fine grain sediment that accumulates at the center, that has a more effect on the frost heave than others, but I can actually figure out.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm asking.
Danielle, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Okay, so I know nothing about drained lake basins. So can I ask a starter question? And then if it makes sense, I'll ask it. Okay, so where does the water go? Like you showed one where it's kind of like you had so where does it go?
Yeah, super interesting. And well, I guess Old Crow, if we remember like the first image of Old Crow Flats, like it's a huge wetland with tons of lakes and rivers and ice wedges and So yeah, there's a lot of places that it can go. In the case of Wolverine Lake at this site, if you zoom out on the satellite imagery, like you can really see that now that there is a drainage network that connects down into a large river system throughout the flats that then continues down to the Porcupine River and all that area. So yeah, right, because a lot of these, and the lakes kind of do vary in sizes. It definitely moves through, I think, when it drains catastrophically like that, it can create channeling through the peat to connect to other lakes. That happens too, that they can drain and water goes into another lake. It can sometimes go through another lake, drain that lake, and then keep going to connect to a river network. And this does become a big issue, especially with these large lakes. The people of Old Crow, Quichin, First Nation, these are people who like have with families who have their cabins on these big lakes. And actually it was in the last 10, 20 years or so, 10 years that Zelma Lake, a large important lake in Old Crow Flats, did drain catastrophically. And there's like video footage of just the lake draining within hours to a day. Yeah, so it's crazy, but it's Old Crow Flats is kind of like a giant sponge too, so it definitely moves around. And this has been happening for a long time too. You can see that there are different drain lake basins, like the footprints of them a bit everywhere. So it's kind of like this cycle of thermokarst lake formation and then drainage. So it's a really dynamic landscape and really cool to see.
Yeah. Okay, so can I ask a follow-up question then?
Yes.
That was amazing. And so I guess having done even less thoughts about macroorganisms and how much does that movement of the lakes then transport some of those macroorganisms? Like, how do you know, or how do you, like when you sort of core there and then a whole bunch of macroorganisms, how do you know that they're coming from, like, how do you track the movement, or can you, or is that some ways that you can actually track where the water goes? Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because in macrofossil analysis, the paleoecology, usually when you're doing when you see the macro plant remains, like macrofossils kind of interesting because they're not actually fossilized, they're just preserved in the peat, but like the plant remains are usually a good representation of what the plant, when the plant was alive, like it was deposited there.
Okay.
People do pollinology, so pollen analysis, and that can get more of a regional look because pollen can be transported around. But yeah, the water movement, that is an interesting thing because when I was looking at my margin, I knew it was a marsh because of all the aquatic species, and then you've got more terrestrial species, or I've got lots of black spruce needles, which could come from a nearby place because right outside of the lake there are today like large black spruce, and so those needles could fall. And then you also have to think that these seeds and leaves can fall into water and be transported and deposited around. So yeah, that is a good question. I think in my site, it's, Old Crow's also very flat. So at least at my site, I'm pretty confident that my macrofossils are from the plants that were nearby.
Totally. It was more of just like a big picture question, but yeah, so cool to try and put those puzzle pieces together.
But to add a cool thing to that though, is that yes, this water movement is so interesting, and like the peat cover is so thick in Old Crow, and this was Beringia. So there are actual fossils like mammoth tusks and camel bones, and that stuff definitely gets transported as these rivers meander. Like the rivers meander like crazy, and so when those cut into these tall sides of peat, and that all erodes, and that exposes really cool fossils and stuff like that.
So cool.
Yes.
Wow. Well, great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Riley.
Thank you again for the wonderful presentation. Thank you for all those who asked questions, and we'll see you for our next seminar.
Thanks so much, everyone.